Now, a figure people have heard of more, I think, than Francisco de Vitoria or Domingo de Soto is, of course, John Locke, the 17th century, by and large, figure who died in 1704. John Locke, of course, is deeply influential and very much influences Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence, naturally. And he's going to talk about natural rights deriving from the idea of self-ownership, the idea that you own yourself. Now, that's not an idea that Locke invented. From what I can see, the first figure to actually talk about this idea of a right of self-ownership is a 13th century scholastic philosopher named Henry of Ghent. And I think he died around 1293. So this long precedes John Locke. But Locke really gives a lot of meat to the idea. And I know when people hear self-ownership, some people feel funny about this. How could you really own yourself? And first of all, we have to understand what's meant by ownership in this case. All that's meant by ownership is range of control. So who has the best moral claim to exercise a range of control over your physical body? Who has a better claim than you yourself? Okay? And then even if we want to get really graphic about it, suppose I actually want to donate a kidney to save my daughter or something. I would have the moral claim to do that. Nobody else could come up to me and say, hey, by the way, I'm going to start yanking body parts out of you. Right? We instinctively recognize that we as individuals have the greatest moral claim to exercise a range of control over our own bodies. Now, an objection that we hear sometimes, I think, from religious people would be that, but doesn't God own everybody? Isn't it kind of impious to claim that you own yourself? But I think the answer to that is, again, we're talking just about range of control, and we're talking about our control over our bodies vis-a-vis other people. Certainly vis-a-vis other people, no one has a better claim than I have. But beyond that, if it's true that God created all things, He created the whole world, He created the earth, He created all the land, well, nobody has any hesitation in saying, I own this land. But no one comes up to him and says, now wait a minute, God owns the land. You have no right to have a deed to this land. So I think if you were to make that argument, it would abolish all ownership. So I think that's not really a concern. Now, self-ownership is a Lockean principle, and what follows from that is the right of private property. And that right derives from, according to Locke, we have a situation in which there is no, beginning of the world is given to us sort of in common in his view, and no one individual has any particular claim on any one thing yet, until such time as people exercise their labor upon some previously unowned good. So I cultivate some soil, I pick some berries, whatever. I mix my labor with the fruits of the earth, and that becomes an extension of me. It becomes an extension of my self-ownership. I then have domain over those things that I've mixed my labor with. And then after I mix my labor with them, I can sell them. So the next person doesn't have to constantly be mixing his labor. We're talking only about previously unowned things. Once they come into ownership by means of my mixing my labor with them, then I can transfer them to other people by means of gifts, will bequests, or sale. And this is how we come to own things. Now, Locke says that there are certain inconveniences. Now, the word inconveniences had a stronger connotation at the time he wrote than it does today, but there were inconveniences of the state of nature. And by state of nature, he means a pre-political world before there were governments, in which all of us were pursuing our natural rights to our lives and our liberty, to the domain of control over our bodies, but that prior to the establishment of a government, we enjoy these things, according to him, only precariously. And you don't need to dwell on this, but I'll just say very quickly, for example, in the state of nature, there's no body of universally recognized law we can appeal to. There's no reliable law enforcement. And thirdly, we have the problem of people being very bad judges in their own cases. People are going to tend to side with themselves if a case of conflict should arise. So according to Locke, we need to remedy these deficiencies by means of civil government, and we therefore delegate to that civil government some portion of the rights we would enjoy completely in the state of nature. We delegate some of these, for example, perhaps some of our self-defense, like for example, judicial services. We would delegate that to governments. And so governments would be there to perform just night watchman services, simply to protect rights of property and right to life, and that would be it. And if they try to exercise powers beyond these that are strictly necessary for these purposes, then the people would have the power to abolish that government, because then that government would be interfering with rather than protecting their rights. Now, a much more recent figure, and I know how fast this is. This is super fast, but that's what an intro is, baby. And then it makes you want to read more, because I know that's what we all need in this room. We're saying, man, oh man, I wish I had something to read, you know? Well, the next guy I want to talk about is much more recent. He died only very recently. Robert Nozick was a Harvard philosopher. What's very significant about him is that his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia from 1974, it's a very rare case of a professional philosopher who's very respected at a top university taking liberty arguments seriously. And that's what he does in this book. And he argues for a minimal state that exists for the provision of rights protection services, but no other. That's what the state is confined to. Now, he was criticized in an article called Libertarianism Without Foundations, because he doesn't give an express account of how people come to enjoy rights or what the source of people's rights might be. He doesn't talk about this expressly in the book. So he was criticized for this. Well, you're just arbitrarily making assertions. But his defense to this, undoubtedly, would be that in this book he is making an appeal to principles that everybody would take for granted. There's no obvious need to belabor the point by giving you a 30-chapter explanation of why slavery is wrong. So I think I could, I've already got a pretty big book here in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. I assume I can take for granted that people are against slavery. I'm going to assume that they already know slavery is bad. So if I then turn around and say, hey, this thing is just like slavery, people will understand that this thing is bad. Or conversely, any form of forced labor. Again, he's assuming that the general run of mankind takes for granted that forced labor is morally wrong. So if he can show that something that the government does is just like forced labor, then likewise we can say that that's morally wrong, without having to go into a lengthy exposition of why forced labor is wrong. This is a moral intuition most people already hold. And so this is right out of his book. He says, and this is Roman numeral 4, part C, he says, taking the earnings of n hours labor is like taking n hours from the person. It is like forcing the person to work n hours for another's purpose. And that's why he argued that an income tax was on a par with forced labor. Because how is it conceptually different? And this drove philosophers crazy. If the best argument you can come up with is, well, you never explained why forced labor is bad, then you won, right? That's what they come up with. Now, on the next page here, we've got an even more radical exposition of natural rights, and this is at the hands of Murray Rothbard, 1926 to 1995. Now, Rothbard, in effect, extends Locke's analysis, and he believes Locke is sort of inconsistent. He makes concessions that he shouldn't make, and Rothbard just eliminates all the concessions. His argument is that the only defensible philosophical position is 100% self-ownership. That there's no alternative. And by the way, now I see I actually have plenty of time, so now I'm going to slow it down a little. Slow down. Okay. All right. I didn't think I'd ever get through this. And now here we are, page 2. Okay. So Rothbard starts with the principle of self-ownership. And he derives that in part indirectly by considering what would the alternatives be to 100% self-ownership. What other possible systems could there be? And if I can show that those systems either don't work or lead to absurdities or fail to answer the question as posed, then we're left with the only alternative, which would be 100% self-ownership.